Hi, everybody. Welcome back. Hi, hello, how are we? It's your girl, Julia, your friend, your gal, maybe. Welcome back to another episode of In My Defense, the podcast. I can't believe we are on episode 3. Like, what? Starting with where we picked up last episode, you'll learn this very quick about me, but I don't feel the need to dilly-dally. Let's just jump back into it. So, last episode, we talked a lot about, and that was the first part of Who Died and Made You King. This is going to be part 2. So last episode, I feel like we talked a lot about the beginning of these feudalistic systems. We talked a lot about, the fall of Rome, the beginning of the Dark Ages, and what systems looked like in the ancient world, in antiquity. We're now going to dive into a bridge between what exactly happened post the fall of Rome. And I really want to set this up, and we're going to cover basically from 700 CE, Common Era, to about 1490s CE. So right before the start of the modern period that we are now in. And really, this is going to be the precursor to colonialism. This is going to be the precursor to chattel slavery. This is going to be the precursor to how we see capitalism and systems today. But all of the events that took place during this time shaped how we live life today. I want to first clarify a couple of things. So, when someone refers to the medieval period or the Dark Ages, the medieval period is technically from about 900, 1000 CE to about 1500 CE. That's the medieval period. The Dark Ages specifically are technically from the start of the fall of Rome, so that's 749 CE, I believe. So 800 CE to basically 1100, 1200 CE. It's essentially, if I could describe it, it would be the time between the fall of Rome and William the Conqueror going to England, mainland England. So that's kind of what we're going to cover in a little bit more. When we refer to the Dark Ages, that is an extremely Eurocentric Western view. If you don't know what Eurocentric means, it just means, anything centric just means that is centered. So we live in a heliocentric solar system. Therefore, we are all centered around the sun. So Eurocentric is framing everything around Europe and in reference to Europe being sort of our center home point. And so when we think about terms like Middle East, that's a Eurocentric term because it's only middle compared to the West. Whereas in the world, there can't really, if we're on a globe, there can't really be a middle. So that's why I'm trying to reteach myself. I don't want to call it the Middle East anymore because that is a westernized view of it. It is just Central Asia. And if we're being realistic, Europe is Western Asia. Okay, Europe and Asia are not two different continents. They're the same. But anyway, the Dark Ages were only dark for the Western people. So basically, you will see in the map above that, once you sort of you have Northern Europe, which is going to be like Poland, Ukraine, technically, like Hungary, Turkey. But it's really once you sort of get into not even Turkey. Technically, Turkey is Central Asia. I really want to honestly cut it off probably by Austria. Everything to the west of that was going through a dark age during the fall, post the fall of Rome, prior to our period of enlightenment and modern times that started in 1500s, which is essentially just the start of the Renaissance period. The Dark Ages were called the Dark Ages because in this Eurocentric and Western view, there wasn't really much going on. And we're going to break this down really specifically, but I want to take this time in this episode to really just, rewrite the understanding of what was going on in the world during this time. It was not a dark age. There was so much modernization, intellectualism, technological advances, medical advances. There were so many things going on during this period that were not happening in the West, and therefore the West period in a dark age because they weren't doing anything. There was no unified government. There was no unified leadership in any way. They really in the West went back to essentially like feudalism, basically. So we're going to break down into it and start this episode up. Okay, so I think the best way to start this is, and I want to tell this in a timeline, so I can talk about things that were happening simultaneously together in groups so that you understand when these things were happening and how multiple things in the world were happening at the same time. Fall of Rome happens around, like the official done with the formal Roman Empire is done by 750. It's Common Era. After that ends, you have a lot of breakup. And I want to add that it didn't end in the same way for everyone, the way we think of a government ending and there just being like this big cataclysmic event or something like that. It really fizzled out in a lot of different ways and slowly, and it really depended on sort of where you were and how close to Rome you were, because it was going to slowly fade out. Obviously, this is a time when information is being passed person to person and by word of mouth, so it's going to slowly fade out. You're slowly going to start to see more and more disruption, civil unrest. During that time, it was sort of the perfect opportunity for some group to come in and seek leadership, in a sense. And so I think that main group that took over Western Europe at that time was really going to be the church and monasteries. So if we're going to talk about churches and monasteries, then we must talk about the Vikings. So when we talk about Vikings, we basically have three kinds. So you have the Swedish Vikings, you have the Danish Vikings, and you have the Norwegian Vikings. So we're going to start by talking about the Norwegian Vikings. Norwegian Vikings, they went to places like Greenland, Iceland, Ireland, Scotland, all over there. And so they kind of went even more west. These are also the people that we get the Vinland sagas from. If you have never read the Vinland sagas, highly recommend. It is sort of one of the many Scandinavian epics. And it discusses how the Vikings were, and I want to be very clear, Viking is not a ethnic group. It is not a community group or anything like that. Viking, the term Viking is like you would go Viking. Like to Viking is to pillage, if that makes sense, and like raid. Also, there weren't like a ton of Vikings. Vikings are really only active between like 700 CE to like, again, around the time that William the Conqueror comes around. And William the Conqueror is kind of a Viking. Kind of. The Norwegians founded places like Dublin. Dublin was a Viking city for a really, really long time. Cork. So you have big figures like Eric the Red goes and he founds Iceland, and then you have his son, Leif Erikson, who's like a really famous one. He is who we get in the Vinland sagas. He goes to Iceland or to Greenland and then on and sort of like accidentally gets to and like for that community finds North America. And in the Vinland sagas, there's this really interesting part where like they're sort of describing what they see from their boat, because they don't actually, at least not in that like Vinland sagas, which is the story version, obviously. They don't actually go onto the land because they describe how from their Viking ship, they get really close to land and they can see from their ship, like basically what they describe as like natural like huts and houses and things on the beaches. And then also people with bows and arrows and shit, like looking like they're preparing to attack them. So they're just kind of like, okay, we're not trying to mess with those people. We're going to keep going. Okay, so the second group is going to be the Danes. These are people from Denmark. These are going to be the main people that are basically going to inhabit England, in Britain. In England at the time, prior to the Danes coming there, you basically had a bunch of monasteries. Christianity existed at this time. It spread throughout the world. It was in lots of different places, and also it was in lots of different places prior to it ever being in Western Europe. The Western Europeans were some of the last people to discover Christianity. Now, at this time, because simultaneously, remember, we have this fall of centralized government, of centralized community. So at this time, monasteries were the only one who really had like dedicated people writing things down and keeping records of things. And that was because, it was sort of their job. Again, churches were starting to garner more support and, I guess in the sense of a business venture, become more successful during this time because lack of community, lack of understanding. I don't know where to look. I don't know how to make sense of things. Again, when you also have that hand in hand with sort of a lack of centralized intellectualism and knowledge seeking, I truly feel, then people aren't going to understand, whereas in ancient Rome they might have said, okay, this storm is science. 50 years later, if it's 2 generations later, these people might say this storm is an act of something way beyond us. So it's possible that there was also a lack of understanding going on as well. A lot of reasons led to people going to the church. They went to the church, they went to Christianity or different forms of Christianity. A lot of random cults and things popped up during this time because people just needed something to put energy into and worship and believe in and have hope in that life was going to be okay. It was also called the dark period in ages in Europe because a lot of people were dying. There was a lot of war, a lot of strife. And again, it's because we are lacking that sort of centralized government, centralized community and understanding. So you have the Danes who basically, as I said, used up their natural resources. They're ready. They need to go push beyond. They're going to go Viking. So when they're sailing around, the British Isles and around England, they see these monasteries on the coast. They see that they're unguarded because the monasteries didn't have any, knights or anything with them. There was no one guarding them. It was just the monks or the nuns or both. So the Vikings saw this as the best opportunity for them to just go in and pillage and raid. But also, where was all the money at this time in Europe, and specifically in Britain? All of the money was in the monasteries because the first creation of art, and art really comes in, was for places like worship and such, and storytelling. It wasn't for home decor and shit like that. They were making jugs for it all had a very specific use. It was all extremely purposeful and practical. So the monasteries were, at that time, they were seeking also like artists and craftsmen who could create different, sculptures, triptychs. Triptych is like a 3-paneled art piece kind of that opens up. So you would see it at the top of an altar. People, royalty in the sense, are seeking out craftsmen and people who could make all of this stuff because hand in hand with the church at this time was tithes. And if you don't know what a tithe is, it basically just means you need to pay the church because a really integral part of Christianity, which is sort of like what Holy Roman Empire started out as, is that, each person does not have the connection to the God source that a priest has or that a holy figure has. Going to a holy figure, being around a holy figure, being around a holy place is going to raise your vibration. These monasteries, when you're paying a tithe to your local parish or something like that, it started out because you had to not necessarily buy your way into heaven, but you had to show your local parish that you cared enough in order for them to consider you and for them to convene with this God source and tell this God source that you are worthy of all of these things. Probably seems really strange and random, and you're like, why do people just go along with this? Well, when the church is also the people, eventually, at this time, it was probably the people who were also, might have been handling the grain. When we go back to the prior episode of those 3 different things that you need to control people, the church, because they had the money, the knowledge, may have been the ones controlling all of that. And, this is when we start to see it really tied hand in hand with government and rulership in some sense. So the Danes are all up in England. They're killing all of these people, pillaging all of that stuff, stealing a bunch of gold from all these monasteries. They're sort of the creators of a lot of aspects of like modern day England. The Danes they were the ones who kind of like didn't stop with England. They went the other way and they decided to go east and they went into mainland Europe, continental Europe. So the Danes basically, because when you go to England, the easiest access you get is to Calais, which is in France. So Rollo basically founds what is modern day Normandy and what Normandy became. Normandy was named after the Northmen, the men from the north that came and sort of invaded. So there was a king in Paris at the time. They basically are sailing along the Seine, these Danes, Rollo and his Vikings, just like pillaging and raiding all the way up until Paris. Charles, who I'm pretty sure was king at the time, but whoever was king of France at the time basically says, you know, this is getting expensive, so let's just give them some land. And he's like, Rollo, you can have this little area by the sea. We'll call it Normandy for you and your big ass men. I'm pretty sure he marries a daughter or something to Rollo, I want to say. Then you have the Swedes. The Swedes are slowly becoming my favorite because I didn't realize the relationship that Sweden and Russia had, as well as like Sweden with all of the Baltic nations. I guess I didn't consider, like, yes, it is way up there, so that makes sense, and they're neighbors, but Russia and Sweden were at war for a long, 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 long time. Russia is obviously huge, huge, huge. It also contains a lot of different ethnic groups, truly. And the Swedes really wanted to push out into that area. So the Swedes were kind of interested in more trade. They didn't do as much like Viking pillaging and fighting like the Norwegians nor the Danes. They set up trade routes all around like the Volga River, which is a big river in Russia. And this was sort of, Sweden had this route to get to Central Asia, to get to the Byzantine Empire, to get to, you know, Turkey, into all those pieces. They could also get to Mongolia and China from there as well. So Sweden kind of had this route in there for trade that really helps them out for a really long period of time, until Russia obviously came into the mix. The Swedes were sort of proto-Russians in a sense. Rus, where you got Russia, comes from the term of like rowers. Europe first became known, like the Europeans first heard about like the Viking terror, we'll call it, like very similar to like satanic panic, but with Vikings almost, because there was a certain population that was being affected by Vikings. Most of the people who were scared of them were not being affected by them at all. I love that it's a term now. I'm making Viking a term. I'm gonna go Viking. When we go down to Africa at this point, let's talk about like a place like Ethiopia. The Ethiopian king by the 4th century has already converted to Christianity. Okay? People in the continent of Africa were practicing Christianity well before any Westerner brought it there. Ethiopia is a thriving hub at the time. Mali is beginning to grow as a thriving hub at the time, other side of the country. These are places where you have these large cities, these large communities, and the biggest thing you have to understand about Africa as a continent is that it is so politically diverse. So politically diverse. And it's hard to maintain all of those peacefully, you know, just as it is in other communities as well. You have a lot of different groups that are all going at the same time, fighting for land, fighting for resources, believing in different things, different religions. It's just a really dynamic environment and a really diverse environment as well. The people of Africa are, you know, and that is, I'm talking, you know, obviously Africa is sort of, you've got like sub-Saharan Africa down to the Horn, and then you have like Northern Africa. And in Northern Africa, obviously, like they are trading with people throughout Asia and throughout Central Asia, Eastern Asia. They know where Europe is as well. I want to make that clear. They're literally across the sea from Morocco is across the sea from the Iberian Peninsula. This is a time, I will say, like, fall of Rome, 749 CE up until like 900. It's really rebuilding years. It's spending time amping up for a lot of golden ages. We're getting ready for the Islamic golden age. We're getting ready for a dynastic golden age in China. In Mesoamerica, in Northern America, in South America, we have metropolises like Cahokia of the Mississippians, where you had over 200,000 people living there at one time. You have these amazing mound cities and these like architectural and urban planning masterpieces that just like made sense and that worked. Once we get into the 1800s, the 800s, the 9th century, this is where we start to take a little bit more of a turn. So in 800, you have Charlemagne hopping onto the scene. Charlemagne starts off as king of the Franks. Remember, we talked about the Franks. They're, best way I can describe the Franks is it's a bunch of white people in Europe. This is basically the precursor and the precedent to the Holy Roman Empire. He comes in and does a lot of uniting. Again, 800s, ending towards the middle end of 800s, you have Rollo going in, creation of Normandy happening. Viking period is in its full swing. And by the 10th to 11th century, this is where stuff really starts getting exciting. You have a lot of other sort of nations stepping onto the scene too. So let's start with Iberia. The Iberian Peninsula is modern day Spain and Portugal. Really beautiful lands. Love it there. I went to visit Portugal. I was an archaeologist there for a little while, and I was down in Sintra, and I was talking to a tour guide, and he said, you cannot talk about Portuguese architecture. You can't talk about the Portuguese culture without saying that it was created and it was formed by the influences of the Jewish and the Moorish people. So I think that's really important to state. You'll see a lot of architectural inspiration. Then in England, my main man, our guy, William the Conqueror, 1066, this guy in Normandy, the Duke of Normandy, William, decides, and he's married to Matilda of Flanders, which is in Belgium, and Normandy's in France. And he basically is like, all right, let's take a group, let's get some guys, and let's go take over England. So he does. He lands in England in 1066, and he starts the formal English monarchy. He wins in the Battle of Hastings, which is a very famous battle. Describe the Battle of Hastings really quickly in 30 seconds. Edward the Confessor dies. He's kind of ruling England at the time. Harold II comes in and takes over for him as his successor. Basically, William says that Edward gave him the throne and that Harold took it. So he lands at Pevensey, invades England, and takes the throne. And he's crowned on Christmas Day in 1066. Now then, when we get into the 1100s, 1200s, so 12th, 13th century, this is going to be the beginning of the Crusades. And I want to talk about the Crusades because a lot of people think that there weren't religious wars. There were many religious wars. Many. Crusades being some of them. Crusades were essentially the Pope's army. He sent people out to fight for their religious freedom, essentially, by just killing people that were not Christian. One of the famous crusades is the Children's Crusade, in which over 40,000, I believe, orphaned, poor children were asked by the Pope to go and fight. And so, they didn't really have any, I don't know if they were forced. The sources of the time are really up in the air, but they were marched. A lot of died on the march, and then a lot died in battle because, yes, they did make them fight. I'm just giving you context. I give you the information so that you can make these choices to the best of your ability, but that is in the history. We also start my favorite family, and where we're really starting to put the breadcrumbs together for the War of the Roses, and a lot of really interesting stuff that happens in England, but then also across Europe and other places too. There's everything booms at this period of time. And I love to talk about this because it's so stupid. It's so stupid. It's so stupid. So you have the Plantagenets that hop onto the scene in 1154, okay? Plantagenets start with Henry II, who's a Plantagenet, and he's ruling England. And this runs through Richard I, John of Gaunt. Henry II is King of England in the early 1100s to the mid 1100s. He is married to Eleanor of Aquitaine. Eleanor is a powerhouse. She's married to Henry, and they have over 10 children together, but then at one point Henry exiles her to Europe. So, like, very complicated relationship, clearly. It's basically just a period of time where you have a bunch of English kings going on crusades. You've got Richard the Lionheart, who goes on the Third Crusade. He's king of England, and he spends majority of his rule outside of England. Fun fact. Goes on and on and on and on. Get into continental Europe. Biggest thing that I want to point out is you have Rudolph I, our Habsburg beginner, and he is going to kick off our Habsburg family, which is a famous family. They are traditionally Austrian-German, I believe, but they ruled for a period of time Austria, Hungary, Germany, Spain. Holy Roman Empire, Spain, Austria, Netherlands. Worth a mention, will go on to be one of, if not the most inbred houses in Europe. So much so that there is now a famous chin for it because they're so interestingly shaped. So you have, like, the Children's Crusade happens in, like, 1212, okay? You have thousands of children marching to their deaths. All of these things are going on. Simultaneously, Oxford University is founded. You have the information. If you couldn't tell, the Children's Crusade really messes with me. It just shocks me. A lot of them were sold into slavery as well, which is just, ugh. Anyway, okay. This is a time where we start to have religious persecution revamping in a really aggressive way. It's very similar to how we view a lot of groups nowadays as well. There's a lot of parallels to be drawn, but you have a Spain that is Christian, that is under the Holy Roman Empire, and you have a, Iberian Peninsula and a Spain that is filled with Muslims and Jews. In a lot of ways, I think the Reconquista was a religious genocide. There were a lot of people that were killed for their religious beliefs. When we get into Africa, we have some really exciting stuff happening. Most of all, and one of my favorite people to talk about is Mansa Musa. If you don't know who Mansa Musa is, he was the Emperor of Mali in like the 1300s. He was the richest man known to have ever lived. And he got a lot of this wealth from those trade routes and having trade routes that come from Mali, which is in northern Africa, and going through the Sahara and interacting with, trading with, and culturally exchanging with sub-Saharan cultures and nations. He visited Cairo for one of his birthdays, and because of the amount of gold he brought and spent there, it completely inflated the economy for years to follow. This is a African man, a Northern African man. A big part of what made him like this really big, hero figure, I think, is that he invested and really changed the way that people saw rulers in and around that environment, in that culture. Mali became an epicenter of culture, of intellectualism, of growth, of advancement. In Mali is Timbuktu, which I'm sure a lot of people have heard of but probably forget about. Timbuktu was an epicenter of community, of people, of northern Africa and the larger, greater area within Central Asia as well. It is said that the universities there, the libraries there, were even more than that of the Library of Alexandria or anything like that. The stories that come out of Timbuktu at the time are amazing, and the fact that they're not taught to more people is really doing a disservice to all of the history that it has. Mansa Musa also is known famously for making a pilgrimage to Mecca. If you don't know, Mecca is like this very famous and holy pilgrimage site for Muslims. Getting to make a pilgrimage is like for, I'd assume, a lot of Muslims, and I don't want to speak too specifically on them because I'm not a Muslim, seek to make that pilgrimage in their life. And so this is also, a great example of how tightly knit a lot of these religions were throughout Africa. I mean, there's so many African Muslims in so many various nations. There's so many African Christians. There was so much trading of culture going on here. And this, we are still over 200 years prior to anyone from Spain, England, or Belgium, anything like that, ever coming, or the Dutch ever coming to Africa. Was so much just life and vitality going on at this time that was not recorded by the West. And again, why would they want to record that when they just paused in a lot of ways? And so that continued everywhere else. And I would understand why they don't want to write about, what's going on everywhere else, because it was so probably terribly embarrassing for them to have just paused for like 500 years. In the Americas, you have Cahokia, again, still a thriving epicenter of people and of culture. Pre-Columbus, it is the largest city north of Mexico, which is really cool and fascinating as well. In Mesoamerica and Central America, you have post-Mayan classical city-states that are taking shape. In central Mexico, the Aztec Triple Alliance that's going on, all of these civilizations that when conquistadors from Spain came to Mexico and saw all of these great cities and urban structures, these were thriving at the time. I would be remiss if I did not spotlight Eastern Asia as well, because there was so much going on there at this time. Starting off in China, you had the revolution of paper money going on. And again, we are in the 12th and 13th centuries right now. In China, you also have the creation of things like gunpowder, okay? You have... and a great movie to watch, a TV show to watch if you haven't, is Shogun. I believe it's on Hulu, I want to say. And it's basically, a shogun is like a head Japanese warrior. I'm not explaining that right. It's show about what's going on during this period in like 1400s, 1500s in Japan when this Portuguese ship lands there. And the cultural shock that the Portuguese go through of how superior the Japanese truly are to them is so eye-opening. Really is something that everyone in modern day should watch, just to have an understanding of how behind Western Europe was at this time. And I need to emphasize that. Beyond that, you also have this really heightened, again, in terms of them, golden age of the Mongol Empire as well. Now, the only reason I don't love to talk about the Mongol Empire is because I'm really not a fan of Genghis Khan. Don't think he was like this cool hero person. And I feel that way about most heroes, most military leaders and things like that. A lot of them were just like not very good people. Genghis Khan also is responsible for raping thousands upon thousands of women. And he is also related to like 1 or 2% of the population currently. The Mongol Empire, however, did, and I want to stress this, like, Genghis Khan is up there with Alexander the Great in terms of what he was able to do. We take that with a grain of salt, of course, because you have to understand about Alexander the Great. And reminder, Alexander the Great is happening 10,000 years prior to this, like a really long time before this. He died when he was 32 or 33, so a lot of the stuff that he did was really, really early in life. Genghis Khan lived, I want to say, well into his 60s. He had a very violent childhood in life, just like a very rough life. Not that that gives you the right to do and kill people en masse, but his empire size and military experience and resume was one of the most impressive of those that have lived. We have this view, because everything is written by the white man, that Western Europe and Europe as a whole was uncontested, the best, the most powerful, when in actuality, Europe is this thin, narrow space and continent and area, which is only united more recently in modern times. It was very separated. is only there and is only maintained that little sliver of space that it holds in Asia because no one up to that point had decided they wanted to waste the time to go kill all those people. There is a reason that Europe has never pushed more east, and that they did not, when they were thinking of colonizing and they wanted more land and resources, they didn't just decide to conquer more of the continental Europe. Okay? And that is because Europe was nothing. No army in Europe could ever touch that of an army in the Ottoman Empire, let alone that of the Mongol Empire, the Persians. Once you got into Central Asia and Eastern Asia, you had forces that were very far above anyone in Europe. Europe was too far. They didn't need to go that far because everybody in that rest of Asia and in Africa had all of the resources. The people who didn't have resources were those in Europe. That is why they were having all of these problems, but also, and I mean this with my whole heart, they were too scared. Even the Holy Roman Empire did not have the basis to stand to a force like the Mongol Empire. We didn't fight the same way. They were superior to us. They also had this fear factor. The Eastern people had this fear factor because they had this unified belief in story and ancestor and in history. You know, my favorite thing to add is that the character sort of, and the idea of like a minotaur, whatever the half man, half horse is, centaur. The myth of the centaur actually comes, and so it obviously stems from ancient Greece. So ancient Persia was one of like this, it would just, we don't spend enough time talking about ancient Persia, truly. The wonder of it. The ancient cultures that existed were this is where we get all our myth from, and that's why it's so tightly entwined with the truth, and with every myth there is a little bit of truth to it, because you had these people who were living in the moment. Like I can't find a better way to say it. Like when we have that idea of like, the Egyptians thought the most important thing you could do in your life was die. Like, yes, a lot of people believed that because it was like you were just living for that moment and living for the time that you had. You know, soldiers were going into battle with their whole hearts because it was like, at least if I die, like I'm going to have died like fighting my heart out, doing this, doing that. There was so much more purpose in everyone's action and what they were doing and how they were living their life than we do now. We live such sheltered and almost like selfish lives now where we think so much about ourselves, whereas people used to live life just because, you know, you were doing it because this is what you knew existed. And you had this time and you knew it was precious, and so you were going to do what you're going to do, and you were going to do it to the best of your ability, or whatever it may be. You know what I mean? I think there was just a different vitality within life and purpose, individual purpose in the world and in life and in your role of what you were supposed to do and what you had. So the ancient Persians were known to be some of the most skilled fighters in that they were very seamless in their motions. They were warriors in the art of being a warrior. And they were really famous for being really skilled with a bow and arrow. Persians were known to be amazing archers. They were also amazing horse riders. Now, Persians were and the Greeks were constantly fighting. Constantly. This is thousands upon thousands of years prior to anything that we're talking about now. But the myth of the centaur and the idea of a centaur actually comes from Greeks, like villages of Greeks, cities of Greeks. Reminder, if you don't know, I've never been to Greece, but to know the typography of Central Asia is very mountainous, hilly, like deep valleys and pasture lands, but then vast hills. So the Greeks would see the Persians coming down and raining down on them over these hills on horseback with their bow and arrows. So that's how the myth of the centaur started, because from far away, they literally looked like they were melded with the horse. Like they were one with the horse. And so it looked like you had all of these half horse, half men people because they just like melded with their animal and with their weapons so seamlessly that that's how it looked. I also love to add in that reminder prior to like Industrial Revolution times ish, probably a little bit, yeah. Prior to like 1700s, if you couldn't see, you couldn't see. Like you had bad eyesight, like you weren't getting glasses, like you couldn't see. So I'm just imagining you have a population of people, maybe like 1 in 5 of them has really bad eyesight, 1 in 4. So they probably genuinely do think that's a centaur coming to attack them. That's my favorite tidbit that a professor has ever told me, ever. I love that story. I think it's so fascinating. But then taking that back into account, you know, they have these myths about them. So, I'm not surprised that the, you know, farmland, pastoral people of France at that time were like, yeah, I'm not going to mess with the Ottomans. I don't want to mess with the Byzantine Empire. I don't want to mess with the Mongols because they are savages. They are going to murder us and kill us and do it for fun. The white people were scared of these black and brown people. They were scared of them, okay? They knew they were weaker. They knew all of these other cultures were superior, okay? And remember, that's maybe why you would write a narrative that portrayed these people as weaker so that you could build up your nationalism, your white nationalism. Meanwhile, the rest of the population can do that without putting themselves above another group of people. Food for thought. Okay, we're so close to being done. Let's finish this strong. Okay, so now we're getting into the 1300s and 1400s. Okay, so 14th and 15th centuries. Century is one more before the period. So if I'm talking about 800s, that is going to be the 9th century. Make sense? Okay, so let's go back to England and France and what's going on there. From mid-1300s to mid-1400s, you have the 100 Years' War that's going on. It's the Plantagenets. Remember them? Remember Henry II, Eleanor of Aquitaine, Plantagenets? Yeah, it's just a family name. It comes because, I can't remember who it was, but this guy wore a Plantagenet is a flower, and so he would wear it on it, and they basically call him like the flower boy because he always wore this Plantagenet on his coat, and so that's where the name comes from. It's like it's a nickname that then turned into like his title, basically. So you have the 100 Years' War, that's the Plantagenets in England fighting against the Valois, which is, I think, had the longest reigning dynasty within France. Valois is going to be everybody from Catherine de Medici married into the Valois line, Marie Antoinette married into the Valois line. France and England are always fighting, which is really funny to me because when I think about it, England has always had the superior army, but France has always had more people and is a larger nation. So it doesn't really make sense why France was always losing. But the best that I can come up with is just like, I think because England was founded by Vikings, they're just superior fighters, interestingly enough. So they were always really like fucking up the French. If you've ever seen the movie The King with Timothée Chalamet, I feel like I referenced that in my last episode too. That's about Henry V, so he's not born yet, but he's coming soon. Oh, well, now by this timeline we're in, he might be born. A great example of how he just like goes up there and absolutely murks the French king. Murks him, whole army, done. Around the same time, you also have key figure that I feel like I have to reference, Robert the Bruce. He's the King of Scotland. I went to school in Scotland. That's where I went to uni, so it has a little space in my heart. I'm also Scottish. Also want to make it very clear that Scotland is its own place, own country, and had its own rulers for a very long time prior to England sticking their nose in somebody else's business. In Europe and Asia, this is the time, 13 and 1400s is when we see our Black Death come in. Hello, Plague. The Plague has entered the chat. She comes in and kills millions of people. Like, wipes out damn near half the population. Maybe a little bit more. A lot of people die from the plague. So men were the only people that could really be doctors. Women could be healers, but the doctor at the end of the day was probably going to make the decision, and that was a man. They did not wash their hands prior to medical procedures. you couldn't believe how high the infant and maternal mortality rate is. Maybe if you're an American, you can, since, we have an actual infant and mortality rate compared to other countries where they have zero. So the Black Death originally comes from trade ships. It comes from rats. Does it come from bats or rats? I can't remember. This is also a time when you start to get a rise of a lot of cults in Europe as well. Like in smaller communities, you have a lot of like cult and paganistic religions and worship styles coming up and stuff too. I mean, with a cataclysmic event like the Black Death, people are confused what's going on. Did we do something wrong? In the 1300s, there's also a super intense famine that goes on in England and Scotland and Ireland as well, and a lot of people die from that too. So there's a lot of intense cataclysmic events that are also coinciding with a lot of these things too. So we sort of hit a reset button for the population there and start over. There's a lot of really good literature out there from periods of the plague. Some of my favorites are the Heptameron, which is in French, but you can find English translations. And it's really good. It's French, but I want to say that the people in it are in Spain. They might have been on holiday or something. It's a bunch of nobles in Spain, and they basically all end up, like, a bunch of these young men and women all end up staying in like this villa to escape the plague, and like they stay there for a couple months to escape it. Every single day someone different has to tell a story, and so it's like a bunch of the stories in there that are really interesting. Really interesting read, and there's a couple other books that are very similar to that are written by like contemporaries of the time. And I think it's honestly just like kind of what they were doing at the, like, it was like whoever you were with when the plague struck out in that area, like you had to just hunker down and not let anybody in, I guess. So, really interesting concept to me. Fascinates me. I also like to add, in 1453, you have the Ottomans taking a charge at Constantinople. This really takes a hit, because remember, by this point in time, post-Charlemagne, Constantinople is basically in the Holy Roman Empire. Ottomans, Islamic people, come in, attack. They gain control of the Silk Road route that goes to Europe, and this is literally what forces the Europeans to have to find another way to get to China, basically, and to India. They used to pay people along that route. They used to pay people like Mansa Musa. They just say, you guys travel it, bring it to our borders, we'll get it from you there. Because, again, Europeans on that route, they're going to get killed. You're done. And they knew that they were, weak people. Think back to last episode when I made that mention of Herodotus. Again, they knew that the Europeans were a weaker people physically, literally, like they could overtake them or trick them or get them. They weren't in their natural habitat nor their lands. The Ottomans retake Constantinople in the mid-1400s. They contain that route, so that is literally the direct cause of what forces a lot of the European nations to do a huge investiture into naval fleets and ships, because they decide that they are going to sail instead of go on the Silk Road across. I know, right? It's kind of mind-boggling. They didn't want to have to deal with the Silk Road anymore. So they were just like, all right, let's hop on these ships. And then that leads to their colonization. And I want to also add, like, there's not really a period where Constantinople falls back to the Westerners. After this period, it's taken over by a sultan of the Ottoman Empire, and that's like basically then where we draw that line. And Constantinople, if you don't know where that's in modern day Turkey. So it really draws that line for us where like Western or Eastern Europe ends and where Central Asia begins. I'd also like to add that 1450s is also when we see the beginning of the printing press. So things are now starting to be mass produced. Remember last episode I also mentioned that like beginning in the 1500s, that's when we first have the Bible printed in English. A religious surge and awakening is going to happen because now people have more access to the text. And it also, again, tightens that relationship to you and that God source, because now you have more of a sense of it in your home. This is also simultaneously when we see a rise in art. Again, not for decoration. It's used so you could create these like your own spiritual center in your home, and a lot of the art that this time, specifically like end of the medieval period, is just going to be religious art, because a lot of the patrons for it, the people paying for it, commissioning it, are going to be the church or people commissioning religious items so they can have a little piece of the church at home. Okay, we're really quick going to go down this path into the creation of the Tudor family. I'm just, again, the drama of the English monarchy baffles me, because like that, first, the Western view of it is so top tier, and I'm like, you didn't have your shit together at all. We're going to start. Plantagenets, remember them? I mentioned them earlier. Yeah, they come back in. Okay. Timothy Chalamet from the movie The King, Henry V, he comes in at this time. He and his wife, Catherine of Valois, I believe, correct me if I'm wrong, Catherine of Valois, have their son, Henry VI. Okay? He ends up being, like, we're just going to call him, he's the Mad King for all intents and purposes. He's crazy. Yeah. He is married to Margaret of Anjou, who's like this kind of scary French lady. Anjou is in France. And like very much like she was just like, all right, my husband is literally useless, so I'm going to take the reins. They have a son. The English people are not happy. Okay, their country is being run by a French woman. A lot of misogyny. There's a lot of weirdness going on. While he is in control, you have two other side parties that are happening right now. First, you have this 13-year-old girl named Margaret Beaufort. When she's 13, her mother marries her off to Edmund Tudor. Edmund is like 30. Like, he's got years on her. I'd also like to add that Margaret was like known, she was still very adolescent. She was prepubescent, like very much had not reached that point in time where she would even be able to safely have a baby. It takes them a long time to conceive a child, but a year after their marriage, Margaret is pregnant. You know what? She might have been 12 when she got married and then 13 when she had the baby. When she's 7 months pregnant, her husband, Edmund, dies. She is then, like, as a woman, you couldn't just be, unless you were, like, well, if you were a widow, you had certain other rights, but because Margaret was so young, literally 13, and pregnant, she needed someone who could watch over her, so Edmund's little brother, Jasper Tudor, became her guardian for all intents and purposes. Once she had the baby, it was an extremely traumatic birth, but the baby survived. She named it Henry. This would go on to be Henry VII, but remember, we have Henry VI, who's actively on the throne when Henry VII is born. Henry VII is not the son of Henry VI. They're not really directly related. Margaret has Henry. She is, my understanding from all the texts I've read is that there is no action happening below the belt past that point ever again. She cannot ever have another child, cannot conceive another child. And she's also a really religious person, so like she doesn't really have a desire to marry ever again either, or have a relationship like that, or sexual relationship with a man. She does end up getting married, but that's not an aspect of their relationship. She becomes a really religious woman. Now, Margaret Beaufort comes from the bastard of one of the earlier kings of England. She might be from Henry II. He is married, has his child out of wedlock, and then after his wife dies, he decides to marry his mistress and legitimize his child. He legitimizes this son, gives him the last name Beaufort, and says, you are legitimate, like you are my child, and I can give you money and all of this stuff, and you can be a child of mine, and you can marry well, but this is with the stipulation that you can never, ever, ever try to take the throne or sit on the throne. Margaret is basically convinced that her son Henry should be king of England. So she keeps telling him this. She's talking about it. She's like, my son's going to be king. She has this agenda. Margaret of Anjou, the sitting queen and sort of regent for her crazy-ass husband, Henry V, is like, no, treason. So Jasper Tudor takes little Henry, who's like a little boy, and they flee and go to France and live in France. Henry grows up speaking French, which later becomes a problem when he comes back to England because he lost that sort of nationalistic aspect. But he grows up in France, becomes a great warrior. Margaret's still trying to get him on the throne somehow from England. Everyone really thinks she's like a crazy, pious lady. Now we have a third line. Stay with me, I know. Cousin of Henry V, sitting king. This is where we get directly back into the Plantagenets. Plantagenets earlier in the line started splitting into two brothers. One became king, the other one did not, and the one who did not become king took on the last name Plantagenet. So that's where we get this third line from. The non-Plantagenet, but cousin of the, like, distant cousin of the Plantagenet now is the main king. So the Plantagenets earlier, the non-ruling Plantagenets, there's this guy. He ends up killed in some sort of a skirmish battle related to Henry V, who is sitting on the throne. His three sons, Guy Plantagenet, who died, his three sons are Edward, who will go on to be Edward III.
So sorry, I actually mean Edward IV.
George Plantagenet, and then Richard III. Three brothers. Edward, George, Richard. Edward is the oldest. George is maybe a couple years younger than him, and then Richard is quite a bit younger than the other two. Edward and George basically get together and declare, we are going to go to war with the king now. Because our father is dead, they're going to rise up and take the throne. They get troops, garner troops, go to war. They find Henry V, because he's literally damn near an invalid, apparently, and drag him out. He ends up, he's dead and displaced. Edward the Plantagenet becomes king of England. He is 18, he is 6'4", and he is said to be very, very good looking. He's young though, so he's got a lot of road ahead of him. They're telling him he needs to marry. They're lining up a list of foreign princesses for him. Meanwhile, Henry or Edward literally just goes out one day and meets this woman, Elizabeth Woodville, who's 5 years older than him and already has 2 kids, and she's a widow. And he's like, yeah, you're beautiful, I want to marry you. They get married. Everybody thinks she's a witch, which I'm here for. They go on to have a bunch of kids. They have 5 daughters and a couple of sons. There are 3 kids that I want to talk about of theirs, okay? Their daughter, who will go on to be queen after them, Elizabeth of York. Then they have 2 sons. These are the princes in the tower, if you've ever heard of that. The princes in the tower are Richard and Edward Plantagenet. So Edward, the king, names his kid, one of his sons Edward after him, and the other one Richard after his younger brother. Edward dies. Before he dies, his middle brother George is just being an asshole, clearly mad because he's not found his place in life. They get into it. Edward has him killed and says, you're my brother, you can pick how you want to die. So George asked to be drowned in his favorite wine. So he was drowned in mulberry wine. That's the end of George Plantagenet for you. Youngest brother, Richard. After Edward dies, he's I need to leave the throne to my oldest son. I can't remember if it was Richard or Edward. But then he's but he's not old enough. So he asks and he writes in that his younger brother Richard, now the only brother left, is going to be the regent for his sons. And basically until his sons are old enough to rule, Richard will be on the throne. Richard's yeah, sure. Richard throws those 2 boys in the tower. They end up dead. And Richard takes the throne. Everyone's huh? I don't think that anybody wanted this. I really don't. Richard III, I don't think he was a very good king. So these 2 lines merged. Our King Henry that was in the middle, he disappears, gets taken over by Edward. He comes in, now his brother Richard's on the throne after having killed his older brother's 2 sons because he wanted to be on the throne. He's chilling here, he's ruling England. Remember our dude, Henry, whose mom was just you're gonna be king one day, I've just decided? He's fucked off in France with his uncle Jasper. So he gets this big army, and Henry comes back and invades England. He beats Richard III in the Battle of Bosworth. They drag Richard's naked body all over and all of this. It was just a whole thing. He becomes Henry VII. No relation to Henry VI, really. Henry based his claim to get York approval saying, I will marry Edward III's daughter, Elizabeth. So the princes in the tower, their sister, Elizabeth. And Henry's last name is Tudor, so he's the Tudor. That's where the Tudor line comes in. Tudor red, and then the York yellow, or the York white flower over it. And they create this sigil. They get married, and then they have a couple of children. Their first child is Arthur. He dies. Their second son is Henry, and he will go on to become Henry VIII. Now, we talked about Henry. Henry's first wife, and his older brother Arthur's wife as well, is Catherine of Aragon. Catherine of Aragon is really, really interesting because she comes from Spain. She's a Spanish princess. Her parents are Queen Isabella of Castile and Ferdinand. They are really, really famous because A, they funded Christopher Columbus. They also are responsible for mass deaths that took place during their lifetime involved with the Spanish Inquisition. And I think that's where we should end it. Like, dare I say, I shouldn't say more about Isabella and Ferdinand. Fascinating stuff, fascinating. Next episode, we are going to talk about colonialism. This was the end of Who Died and Made You King? The answer is literally everybody. The 99% died so that the 1% could be king. So I hope that you enjoyed. Next time is going to be a really heavy episode. Again, these people were scared of Black and brown people and women. I think now you need to go like splash cold water on your face, maybe. Have something to eat, a little nibble. Thanks for watching. Bye, guys.